Welcome to another one of our Talking Brain series on Brain Book. Today, I'm really excited because we're joined by somebody who really represents the next generation in neurosurgery. We're delighted to have Dr. Ollie Burton. Dr. Ollie is a ST1 Neurosurgery Trainee at the South West Neurosurgery Centre in Plymouth, where he's also undertaking an academic clinical fellowship focusing on AI and research and harnessing the use of AI, accelerating new neurosurgical treatments. Before starting his neurosurgical training, Ollie completed a highly competitive research fellowship at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, contributing to cutting-edge work at one of the world's leading neuroscience centres. He also completed a very prestigious FMLM National Medical Directors Clinical Fellowship, gaining leadership experience at national level. With a career already spanning much research, innovation, and leadership, right at the very start of his surgical career, Ollie brings a unique perspective on the future of neurosurgery, the rise of AI in medicine, and ultimately what lies ahead for trainees entering the world of neurosurgery and medicine. Ollie, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're so very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I think we kind of wanted to talk a little bit today about a number of things. I think what's really interesting is your own journey into medicine and neurosurgery specifically, but also I think the kind of theme of leadership and how much you've achieved in such a short career already, which is so impressive. But not just that, but just talking about what you've done with leadership and you've taken a real role in terms of being a vocal voice for doctors, specifically on social media and YouTube. You've talked about things outside of neurosurgery, things which really concern trainees and doctors. And I think a lot of us, speaking to many of my colleagues, we all really see the impact you have actually for having a voice for doctors like us, whether it comes to training, opportunities, and a number of things. And I want to commend you and say a massive thank you to you for that. And I want to talk a little bit about that today as well, your role in leadership and ultimately what's brought you into neurosurgery.
Okay, there's a lot. Thank you for having me. I guess we could start with maybe getting into neurosurgery first and then leadership, just to give people, because I'm here talking to BrainBook, this amazing organization that I've certainly been aware of for many, many years and did some work with many years ago. Did some filming with Alex and Brandon at the time. So how I ended up in neurosurgery is just an experience that happened at medical school, that I can't go into the fine details of for confidentiality reasons, but the gist of it is that I got lost during my surgical placement at medical school, in a part of the hospital that I wasn't familiar with. This is genuinely true, and ended up being found, wandering in the corridor by a passing registrar who turned out, as it happens, to be a neurosurgery trainee at the hospital I was at. This was at University Hospital Coventry, which is the main unit attached to Warwick Medical School. And she said, "Oh, you look lost. Are you okay?" And I said, I'm on my surgical block. I'm looking for such and such." And anyway, ended up chatting to this registrar, ended up going to meet the neurosurgical team and spending some time with them. And that was an introduction to not just neurosurgery as a specialty, but to audit and research and, all of these other things that doctors end up doing, kind of whether they want to or not. But none of these things probably would have happened if that registrar hadn't gone out of her way to, make me feel welcome and make me feel part of the team. And I caught up with her earlier this year, actually, at a neurosurgical conference, and she's just CCT'd, so she's qualified, ready to be a consultant now. So this was back in time at the point I met her 6, 7, 8 years ago. She would have been much closer to the start of her neurosurgical career. And then absolutely fell in love with the specialty, particularly what I love about neurosurgery and why I picked it to pursue compared to other things is the emphasis on communication. When you speak to different trainees and consultants about why they like the specialty, you get more of a spread of responses than I think you would instinctively think you do. And it's not just all about the surgery, although that is a very common answer. Some of the surgery is really cool. Different people like different things, and what I really like is the challenging aspect of the communication, in that a lot of the conditions that we deal with are acutely life or limb threatening and very scary. You know, most people, when they hear the phrase brain surgery, that they themselves are going to have it or a family member is going to have it, they are terrified, justifiably, perhaps. And there's a great responsibility, I think, in helping people through whatever it is that you need to do or not do for them, communicating why you're doing what you're doing and the pathology they have and the help they need and so on. That's a great challenge that I really enjoy and take very seriously. The other thing that you asked was about getting into leadership, and that one's that one's tricky because I still don't I don't see myself as a as a leader particularly in any meaningful way. I think I've ended up in positions of leadership, and some of the questions that you sent through for me to have a look at are kind of on that theme. But I've ended up in positions of leadership, whether I wanted to be there or not, and I've therefore taken steps to not prepare myself, but get training and reading on how to be an effective leader and trying to make sure that I take those roles seriously. But I have also made lots of mistakes when it comes to leadership. Doctors routinely are not trained to be effective leaders and managers. You know, we're trained to be doctors and surgeons, but although, if you think about it, we do an immense amount of leadership in our day to day, just by virtue of doing our roles, but we receive very little in the way of formal leadership training for that leadership that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much. And I think yeah, that was quite a big question we had for you. And I think what's so interesting is how you've kind of fallen into a career of neurosurgery because of one interaction that you had in a corridor. I think is incredible. I think, you know, speaking to a lot of people in the field of neurosurgery, they're kind of like, oh, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon since a kid, or it's something I kind of wanted to
Yeah.
do early on. And I think that's incredible. And I think that speaks a lot for neurosurgery as a profession, because I think, and I'm not just trying to be biased because we're all in kind of in the field in one way or another, but it's, you'll genuinely meet some of the most interesting people you've ever met in neurosurgery. They're fascinating characters. And I remember once having dinner with one of the kind of pediatric neurosurgeons, and I always thought it was incredible how you combine pediatrics and neurosurgery. It's two really kind of complex things, yes, but very kind of tertiary specialties, very specialized, and putting it together, there's, you know, it can get very complex and actually quite you know, for want of a better word, tricky to deal with, because you're dealing with children and you're dealing with the brains. And I remember speaking to her, I said, how do you get through it? And she said, I forget every case after I do it. And it's interesting, some of the dissociation people have because of how much neurosurgeons have to take on. So there's such a burden that actually, you know, you got to remember sometimes they're still just humans, and it's fascinating, some of the people you meet. And I'm sure yourself, Ollie, from SBNS and your time in Plymouth and even at Queen Square. Moving on kind of onto that aspect, how was your time at Queen Square? And talk to me kind of the brilliant year you spent there with regards to research and some of the mentors you developed, whether that's Hanny Marcus or some of the other
Yeah.
tech fellows. How was that?
Yeah, I mean that what you were just saying about meeting characters and people. I mean, d doctors are um a peculiar, not peculiar, that's not the right word, but we when we select who are going to be doctors, obviously we tend to select a sort of particular group of people, and we select for certain personalities and certain ways that people are. I don't know whether it's just an artifact of neurosurgery being a small specialty, but it just seems to be saturated with like some really incredible people, and I felt that even at my ST1 boot camp. So when you start training as a neurosurgeon, within the first couple of months, you all meet up, the new trainees in Preston in Lancashire, and you do a week of structured sort of simulation and training and starting to learn to operate. Pardon me. And you meet everyone in your cohort, and I was sat there on some of the days thinking, like, I cannot believe that some of the people like that I'm sat in a room with, and these are people at the start of their career. And then you can imagine in a place like Queen Square, just like it's on another level. The people that you're exposed to it's the equivalent of what I imagine going into the average IT office at Google or somewhere like that must be like, where you're exposed to these people, especially people like Prof Marcus, that are just operating on another like plane of existence. Um, in terms of how I ended up there, I finished my foundation training. I had done what was then the academic foundation program, is now called the specialized foundation program, but it's the same thing. And none of the tracks that were available to me at the trust that I was working. So I really wanted to go back to Newcastle at that time in the Northern Deanery, but there are no academic tracks there that have a neurosurgery post. The hospital has a neurosurgery department. This is at the RVI in Newcastle, but at that time, I don't know if it's changed, there were no academic posts that had a neurosurgery job. So I already knew that I would likely need to get a bit more experience. So I finished my foundation training. I didn't apply for specialty training because I wanted some more SHO experience in neurosurgery. And then I applied for this post under at Queen Square under Prof Marcus. And again, this was we were just talking about fortuity, but this is true. I'm not making this up. I had not heard of Hanny Marcus at this time, which is odd, right, for someone interested in neurosurgery. But I guess I was in the other half of the country and away from the sort of academic scene. And my now wife was doing a workshop for the UCL Women in Surgery Society. And so I went into London with her this weekend. It happened some random weekend. We went into London together. I dropped her off and went off. I was going off into London to do something else and would pick her up at the other end of the day. And one of the organizers came up to me and said, actually, can you help us? Because we've had someone drop out, one of the panelists on in the careers section. You're not a woman in surgery, but we have a gap and we need some help. Would you mind just sitting in and helping? And I was, yeah, sure, of course. So I stayed around and again happened to be sat on the same table as this doctor, and we got chatting, and she said, "Oh, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm doing my fellowship at Queen Square." And I was like, "Oh, that's really cool. I've heard of Queen Square. I want an SHO job. I'm looking for an SHO job after I finish my foundation training." And she's like, "Oh, you should speak to Hanny Marcus, this guy. He runs a job, and I think it's opening soon. You should apply for it." And anyway, she told me what to look out for, and I waited for it to come out and got the job. And again, I don't think I would have known that it existed without this chance meeting. And so Mr. Marcus, Prof. Marcus now, he takes three fellows a year, three junior fellows now into what's called the tech group, surgical technology at Queen Square. And he is very good at matching you with projects and with sort of activity that fits your background and your experience. So since I had a background in qualitative research and education research, which is what my AFP was themed in, I ended up as the simulation fellow at Queen Square doing simulation work in neurosurgery, and that's what I ended up doing in that year, two or three different projects looking at how patients and the public feel about, or how they sort of feel about different simulation modalities and what that might mean for neurosurgical training, and then a few projects validating surgical simulators, which is how you academically decide whether or not a simulator or a simulation tool is effective at being used for training, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And honestly, I have to say, following what you guys have done at Queen Square, they do incredible work, honestly, from research and just education for future neurosurgeons. I think it's something that actually, when you're in the field, I guess at SHO level and trying to make that jump, there's not much by way of neurosurgical education. I think it's quite shielded sometimes. Students oftentimes don't really have much exposure. I mean, one thing Queen Square I think are amazing at is putting on that showcase of neurosurgery education with their simulations and
Mm.
their the regular courses they do from all faculties and all subspecialties of neurosurgery. It's incredible, and they have a showcase of trainees and neurosurgeons across the field doing kind of boots on the ground work with the trainees and students. And I think it's incredible. I think it's one of the best places, premier places in the world for neurosurgery. And I think it's it's so interesting the year you spent there, and I'm sure you gained so much being somebody who's obviously got a huge background in research yourself, or at least you're exposed to that quite early on with the SFP. What if you could take one thing from Queen Square that turned you into the person you are today? What would you take from Queen Square?
It's a good question. The thing that I would say is I think about the value of mentorship, and I'm going to give an answer that is not uh, that is not really specific either to neurosurgery or to research or anything like that, but it's getting exposed to the right people and how they think and how they do things and manage their time. And what I will say for Prof. Marcus is I had a really difficult time during that year. There was a lot going on and lots of external stresses, and the way that he managed that, or the way that he supported me through making my application to specialty training during that first year, even though I wasn't successful, it would have been very, very easy for someone of his standing or his position to to not, to simply not support me or not to help me, and just let me get on with things because he's an incredibly busy guy, as are a lot of these people, but he is an incredible guy, and underneath all of that stuff, the research that he does and the amazing surgery and all of these things, he is a genuinely wonderful person who I look up to very, very much. And if I make it to the end of my training and I'm a tenth of the surgeon or the academic that he is, which which is probably unlikely, I'd settle for a 20th. I'd be in a very, very good place. And so I think my answer is about finding that mentor, or even if it's time limited, obviously, because I'm not there at Queen Square anymore, but I had a year working for him and around him and my colleagues, Jiggy and Joachim, who I did my fellowship with. I learned so much from them too. So I think it's mentorship is very important and learning everything that you can when you're exposed to those centers and those people. That's what I would say is every opportunity is a learning opportunity.
Absolutely. No, I think you put it beautifully, and yeah, I guess that kind of moving on a little bit from that, but kind of at the same level, what would you say to students or to people who want to get into neurosurgery, let's say a bit earlier on, final year, fourth year medical school, because it's getting really competitive now. I think
Yeah.
there's no, kind of, you can't be around the bush here. Specialty applications are kind of going through the roof. They're only getting worse every year.
Yeah.
And I think we're probably now moving into a situation where you need to have a good portfolio from the fifth year of medical school to actually get into something like
Mm.
neurosurgery, for example, first time. And cardiothoracics is a
Mm.
bit even worse. But what would you say to a fourth year medical student at the moment who wants to get into neurosurgery? What piece of advice would you give them in terms of navigating that career into probably one of the most competitive specialties in the world?
Yeah, there's so I have a few things to say. This is something I think about a lot, and as you can imagine, it's something that I answer or I try to answer questions about a lot, because of having the sort of social media presence and being visibly in neurosurgery, which is a fairly niche field. Naturally, people gravitate to that and they ask lots of very good questions, and the conversations are hard. So I have some encouraging things to say, some discouraging things to say, and a little bit of pragmatism. So to start with the encouraging things, it the competition is steep, but it remains as possible as it has always been, because most of the competition data that you will see is to do with high numbers of people applying, which inflates the perceived competition ratios. It is unlikely, in my view, that most of the people who apply for neurosurgery training are realistic candidates. What I mean by that is that whether you have 100 people applying, 500 people, 1,000, 10,000 people applying, the proportion of people that are gonna make it to the interview stage, and actually have a decent chance at getting a post, I suspect that number remains proportionally actually quite stable. The competition is an artifact of many more people applying who unfortunately, for better or worse, do not have a realistic chance at getting a post. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is, I think there's a lot of anxiety, understandably even, about if I don't have 10 papers or I don't have an international research prize or I don't have this or I don't have that, is it even worth applying? The answer to this is always the same, and I actually get a little bit frustrated at answering this question. Not that it's anyone's fault, but it's because people don't believe me when I tell them, is that they say, what do I need to focus on? What's the best thing that I can be doing? And I say, go and look at the ST1 shortlisting matrix because it tells you what you need to do and just do that. But people don't believe me in that. They go like, yeah, well, but you know, what if I don't have 5 papers or 10 papers, or the guy next to me has 20 papers, or what? It doesn't matter. Like, what the matrix tells you need to do is what you need to do. And that is a mix of a bit of research, an audit or two, some quality improvement, some leadership experience, some teaching experience, an extra degree if you've got one. There's actually not that much to it. And if it says that there are only two or three points on your shortlisting available for research, then it should be pretty self-evident that you don't need 10 papers, 20 papers. Like you need one or two decent papers. That's more than enough. And that's a lofty achievement by itself. And I think what I was saying about the people that want to go into neurosurgery tend to be sort of characters anyway, and everyone's sort of mega competitive and driven. It's very easy to get lost in all of that and to become quite unhappy. But do one or two of everything that it tells you to do it well, and you genuinely don't need to do any more than that. Um, it is possible, and like we 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 clearly do hire normal, well-adjusted people in the specialty. I'm not saying that I'm one of them. I'm not saying that I am particularly well-adjusted, but there are people uh, that are normal and lovely and nice and will make great surgeons. Then the discouraging stuff, which which has to be balanced. I'm just gonna refocus my camera a sec. Um, the first of these things to understand is that the specialty is in a bad place when it comes to workforce planning, and this is something that I don't think we should be shy about. We need to be talking about it, and we were talking before about talking up about issues that affect trainees and employment and all of these things. Neurosurgery as a specialty in the UK, for much the same reasons that cardiothoracics is, as you say, it's in an existentially very difficult place. And that is because the workforce planning for it is very complicated and very, very difficult. And it's been done badly in the past. Materially, what that means is that there are effectively way too many people being trained for the number of consultant posts that there are. There are thought, my understanding as of the last figures is that there's thought to be approximately 60 or so, although the number may have fluctuated, people who have finished training, bearing in mind that neurosurgery training is very long, very difficult, and very difficult to get into, about 60 or so people with no consultant job to go into, or people waiting years and years doing fellowships one after another just to stay employed. And that's obviously not a healthy place for any workforce to be in. And if you're committing to the specialty, obviously that's a huge thing to go through all of that, do all of the training, and then potentially have not have a job at the end. So going in with an open mind and open eyes about that is really important. And then secondly, um, it's it's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot. It's physically very, very tiring. The hours are very, very long, and you've got to be super switched on about your training, more so perhaps than in other specialties, because neurosurgery is high acuity and an often emergency specialty. You really have to take control and onus of your own training, and that's something that I'm still adjusting to now as a new trainee. You will be working very hard, very long hours for many years, and I think figuring out how to pace ourselves through that is going to be really important. And then the last pragmatic thing to say, because I've waffled a bit, is do not single apply to neurosurgery. I think that is a terrible idea, and you should, in parallel, and this is a bit nerve-wracking because I'm giving people more work to do, but just as much as you're working on your neurosurgical portfolio, you should be working on the assumption that you will not be successful, and you should be developing a portfolio to support application to other specialties. Because as you say, there is a very real existential risk of remaining of being unemployed. And one of the best things that I did, or the thing that I did that I think was the most sensible, is applying for other specialties as well and having a portfolio that has allowed me to be successful in being offered jobs in those other specialties as well, and being prepared to take one of them if neurosurgery hadn't worked out. And I will be very blunt and open about that. If I was offered a radiology post as well, and if I had not had my neurosurgery job come through, then I would have taken it, and I was mentally ready to do that. So I think it's okay to really, really want to be a neurosurgeon, but you need to protect yourself in case things don't work out exactly the way that you hope they might. And particularly if you've got a partner or kids or, dependents, going all in on neurosurgery and leaving yourself no wiggle room is not a sensible idea.
No, absolutely, and I think only a future neurosurgeon would probably have the guts to only apply for for neurosurgery. But it's really interesting what you've mentioned, and just going back to 60 potential consultants that we have that are doing kind of, we call them fellows, don't we? And they're awaiting consultant posts, but they're kind of just consultants in waiting. And it's like you see them doing multiple fellowships, and it's now 8 years of specialty training, multiple fellowships all over the world in different subspecialties. And it seems even now that's not enough, and it's really worrying. But just talking about that, but I guess maybe on a kind of at a more junior level, you touch upon something really interesting there, Ollie, and that's what if you don't get in, and the kind of rise of unemployment with doctors, which honestly, if you speak to the general public, they'd probably say that again. But it's true, and it's something that, I know you've been talking a lot about, Ollie, as well, which I have to say a massive thank you, because it is something that can sometimes be, not spoken about much. But there is a rising unemployment crisis. Let's say for doctors who apply for neurosurgery and don't get in after F2, what would you suggest to that person to do with that year? And let's talk about things such as maybe things they could do, things they can apply for, other things such as other surgical specialties or even research. What would you say is the best thing they could do in that year?
Yeah. So the first thing is you need contingency, because there's security in that, especially now. You need plan A, B, C, D, E, and so on and so forth. So you should do your specialty training applications. That's great. And in my view, you should apply to multiple specialties as well. Especially neurosurgery, for example, it uses the MSRA, the multi-specialty recruitment assessment exam. So you've got to take that exam anyway. And therefore, to me, it is sensible if you can find other specialties that use it as part of recruitment. I should be very frank that I do not appreciate or believe in the use of the MSRA for non-GP specialties, but it is as it is. And so I applied for core surgical training, for example, and radiology, both of which use the MSRA. So you're not wasting that effort on one application by studying very hard for that one exam. So you put in your specialty training applications, which is usually in November. Then in the months following, so usually December, January, February, that is when other jobs start to appear on the job market. So if you look at NHS jobs, track jobs, these websites, hospitals will start to put out for their other jobs. So trust grade SHOs, locum doctors, teaching fellows, research fellows, all of these things will start to appear in the system. And so the first thing is talk to people to find out when those jobs are going to appear, because increasingly they will only be up for a day or two, and then they'll be so swamped with applications that they'll close immediately. So if you, at this point, if you want to be a trust grade SHO in neurosurgery at Oxford, then you need to be emailing the department and saying, I'm interested in working for you. When is the job advert going to go out? I think that's perfectly okay. And I did that and got some helpful answers and applied for those jobs. I ended up doing the one at Queen Square, as you said. But then I didn't get in, right? So I did my F3, my research fellowship at Queen Square. I wasn't successful. I ranked in the top 10% of applicants, but didn't get a job. And then, so I was doing this again and looking for other work. And that's how I ended up doing the FMLM leadership fellow post, just because I saw it being advertised. And by that point, I was physically exhausted from doing that post and decided that I wanted something different. And I'd done a research fellow job, but actually I thought, well, I've had no formal leadership training, in terms of full-time experience. Maybe this is the right way to spend my time. And so I applied for it and got the job and ended up doing that for a year and had a really interesting time working on national audit and quality improvement with the team over at HQIP, the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership, and learned a lot from again some really inspirational people. So protecting yourself is the first thing. Like you need a job, any job, otherwise you're going to be unemployed. The second thing is, I guess, thinking about where your gaps are. So if what you want is more clinical experience, then really what you want is a trust grade SHO post in neurosurgery or a locally employed doctor or a core doctor or whatever term it is that a trust would use, but it all describes the same thing, a locally employed SHO. But you might want some more teaching experience, and then, you might apply for a teaching fellow role. You might want to do more research, then you need to be looking for research fellowships, of which there are quite a lot in neurosurgery. There's a few at Queen Square, there's a few at King's, a few at Oxford, and so on and so forth. So obviously, ideally, try and use that year to build build yourself in a way where you're almost making the most of your lack of experience in an area, because then it's not time badly spent. So that's that. And failing all else, you can build generic skills. So even if you can't get a post in neurosurgery, if you can get a trust grade post working as any sort of surgical doctor, and you're building your theatre, your suturing, or your theatre skills, or your management of perioperative patients, the principles are broadly the same in any kind of surgery, in terms of how you manage people in the perioperative period. So that wouldn't be a bad thing either. And I have colleagues that have ended up working in, orthopedics or trauma or even general surgery. And that's as great, as getting a neurosurgery post, because you're still developing as a doctor. And I guess that's what I would say. Just try and make sure that you are still developing in some way.
Amazing answer, and I think you you've kind of really summarized it well there. I guess you first thing you need to be aware of is the opening times for the post, because you're right, they go really quick within days, and it's quite sad actually sometimes to see that's the way it is. I mean, how much unemployment there is in the doctors' workforce, especially when you look at the state of the NHS. It really shouldn't be like that. But I think also taking away from what you've talked about, I just want to spend a little bit more time on that, Ollie. But the FMLM leadership post that you did, how was that, and what did you take from there that you are now embedding into your neurosurgery ST1 role in Plymouth?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a great year. I had absolutely no idea what to expect. Absolutely none. I'd never heard of the organization which I was going to work for, and as I told them when I joined, I've never heard of you. I have no idea what it is that you do, but I know that your job is in quality improvement, and I recognize that that is something that's very important to do well. And quality improvement it's an academic discipline that is sort of parallel to research, but is not quite the same. And often one of the things we talk about in early academic medical interviews is what is the difference between research, quality improvement, service evaluation, etc. All of these things are slightly different in terms of how they work. And QI is also one of those things that, much like research, it needs to be methodologically rigorous and it needs to be done very well and planned properly with the appropriate governance and so on and so forth. And it drives, certainly in the NHS, a lot of our day to day is driven by QI initiatives. So that's the first thing. Another major change is that it was entirely remote. I worked from home for a year doing that post, which you can imagine going from a full, resident on-call neurosurgery post at a major London centre to working from home all of a sudden. And I stacked my hours in such a way that I was only working 4 days per week. That was a crazy change and one that was actually very welcome. I suddenly had much more control over my own time in a way that I wasn't used to. But it was great. And in terms of what that post is, because I realize I haven't really explained it, is the fellowship it's run by the FMLM. Who are the FMLM? It is the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management. And the goal of that fellowship, they take about, I believe, about 20 or so fellows a year. So that there's actually a sizable number of jobs relative. And it's trying to identify people with leadership potential and giving them formalized and structured training. The idea usually is it's what's called an UP, an out of program experience, where someone who is already in training, so you might be a registrar in neurosurgery or in cardiology or ophthalmology or whatever. The idea is that you would take a year out of your clinical training, train up in leadership and management methods and theory, and then go back such that by the time you become a senior trainee and a consultant, you are equipped to, lead and to instigate change. Now, for whatever reason, they agreed to give me a job at the start of my career, and you can do that. You can apply as a post FY1 doctor, so you can do it even as a very junior doctor. And that just gives you a different perspective on things. And certainly the organization I went to, I think they were quite pleased to have someone who was a bit more junior with different thoughts and feelings on things as compared to somebody who might be a bit more senior. You just get different perspectives. So it's a year about learning the theory and methods of leadership, how to lead and manage effectively. The idea being that you would take that into a formal leadership role in the future once you're back in the NHS. And it comes back to a comment that I made before about how doctors, by virtue of being a doctor, you end up in leadership positions kind of not accidentally, but all the time, just by virtue of what what you do day to day at work, and you are the person that people come to guidance from, which is what we're trained to do. But particularly as doctors become more senior and they become consultants and they're suddenly in charge of leading a medical team, they actually receive frighteningly little formal instruction in how to do that and how to manage a team and how to lead, even though that is their job. And the other thing I would say is that doctors don't we don't necessarily make good leaders and managers, by virtue of our medical training. I think that's a wrong assumption to make. I don't think that doctors are selected particularly for their leadership potential. They're selected in theory for who's going to be a good doctor, right? Or who's going to be good at medicine or surgery. And the same is true at specialty selection. You're trying to identify who will make a good neurosurgeon or who will make a good cardiologist or whatever. But there's not actually very much in the way of leadership suitability assessment. And some people don't don't make good leaders. Some doctors just aren't good at leadership or management. And, in some senses, that's okay because it might be unfair to naturally expect a random person to be a good leader or manager if you haven't trained them to be one. That's maybe unreasonable. But the way that our system works is we have a wish and a prayer that the people we're going to train as doctors turn out to be good leaders, don't we? Because consultants are in charge of the team. And maybe we can do a bit better than just hoping that people are going to turn out to be good leaders. Maybe we could train them.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Ollie, and I think that's really interesting you mentioned that. And I guess the thing I would say to follow that up, Ollie, is what would you say about the nature of the medical school curriculum? Do you think, like you've just mentioned, we're getting enough exposure, or students are getting enough exposure to becoming future leaders? Because, like you mentioned, as a doctor, you're already going to be in a leadership role, whether that's making plans or leading a ward round or even ultimately leading a crash call.
Yeah.
I think those are the kind of skills not necessarily taught to you in medical school, number one. And I think number two, the thing I'd say is other things now. So we're talking about research and portfolios and hierarchies of evidence and systematic reviews. And oftentimes we expect, doctors at F1, F2 level and ST1, they have an incredible portfolio of research. But do you think enough of that is being taught to undergraduate students? Because I don't think a lot of them actually realize how important that stuff is when it gets to applying for jobs, because a lot of the focus at that time is, I need to pass my OSCEs, I need to pass my MCQs. What do you think is lacking in the medical curriculum?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really fair question, and it's a really difficult question because the medical school curriculum is jam-packed, and it's jam-packed with good stuff. It's really, my camera keeps going out of focus. I'm really sorry. It's really hard to design a curriculum, and medical schools have a regulated number of hours to work with. I believe it's about 5,500 hours. That's the length of a medical degree and what you can cram into it. I'm very wary of saying XYZ isn't in the medical school curriculum and probably should be, because the question then comes is what are you going to kick out to make room for it? And at least from my perspective, and I think there's various schools of thought on this. The most important thing that a medical school degree or experience needs to achieve is it gives people the right grounding in the basic and clinical sciences to make them safe and effective diagnosticians, clinicians, medical practitioners. To me, the focus should be on the science, almost above all else. And I think there has been a move towards the phrase I'm going to use is soft skills. I'm not sure that's the right phrase because it maybe devalues them as well, but more on communication and these things. And that means that then less is done on the basic sciences and data sciences and how to think like a doctor, because room has to be made for other things. And I I don't want us to perpetuate a downward spiral where we keep moving more and more of the basic and clinical sciences out. Medical school really should be about anatomy and physiology, and pharmacology and so on. But in terms of how we train the next generation of leaders, do I think that medical school is necessarily the right place to do that? Maybe not when it comes to leadership, but certainly foundation training, I think, could be the place to do that. I think you need to get people to like the basic place of qualification before you start training them to be a leader. They need to get qualified first. So that's one thing. He says having done a leadership fellow job before he was qualified to do anything in neurosurgery. So I realize I'm being slightly hypocritical. In terms of research, though, I actually feel slightly differently because I think that the basic sciences and particularly statistics, that is the area where I think that more could be done at medical school, placing everything that we do into its statistical, mathematical place at a very basic fundamental level, understanding how you design experiments, how you run research, how you run a clinical trial, how you interpret statistical tests and findings. I think we should be doing that anyway because so much of medical practice is fundamentally rooted in that data science and in that practice. And although I don't think it is the case that all doctors should necessarily do research, or really what I think is that people shouldn't be forced to do research if they don't want to. And I think using research for selecting trainees is probably a bad idea. Everyone does need to be able to understand and interrogate research. That is absolutely non-negotiable, in my view, for a practicing doctor, because that's what guides your practice and tells you when to do a particular test versus not doing a test. If you look at the news today, it's probably full of well-intentioned but misguided comments about prostate cancer screening, for example. That's in the news at the moment. And no matter what anybody tells you, right, or no matter how anybody feels about it or doesn't feel about it, or how many people they know in their family that had prostate cancer, we do not know whether prostate cancer screening using the PSA blood test is a good idea or not. Nobody knows. It's there's so much that we don't know that a whole trial is about to be run out of Imperial. It may have started recruiting now to answer that question. And until that trial is done, assuming that we get some sort of meaningful result from that trial, no one can tell you what the answer is. And that's the type of question that doctors in general should be very comfortable with, is being able to critically appraise the evidence on a particular question or a paper or some data that is put in front of you, and being able to ask the right questions. That, I think, could be done at medical school when we're teaching people how to think like a doctor. That sort of statistical thinking and interrogation, personally, I think is part of thinking like a doctor.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you, Ollie, and I think it's interesting the stuff you mentioned about medical school and what we're going to kick out. I think that's a really valid point, and I think it's really interesting you say that. And I think I just wanted to move on to something different. It's another thing I know you're quite vocal on, Ollie, on your social media. I think the medical degree now, would you say, in your opinion, is sometimes being undervalued within the NHS setting, meaning that there's alternative roles or alternative practitioners and other job roles now that are arising that potentially you could say maybe substituting the role, or as we
Oh,
say, supplementing the role of doctor. What do you
yeah,
make of that topic? I know that's yeah.
it
What would
yeah,
you say about that?
it's contentious, right? The first thing that we can say is that workforce substitution in general is a highly contentious issue. I think we should all be able to agree on that. Has it happened? Absolutely, yes, it has happened across workforces, and so not just medical doctors. Obviously, that's what we might be interested in, but it happens in other workforces as well. And there's a lot of research that has been done, particularly with nurses, where exactly the same phenomenon has happened. Why does it happen, or to some degree, why must it happen? Why is it something that we would expect to keep seeing? The answer is workforce planning or lack of workforce planning. And you asked earlier something like, how could we end up in this situation where we have so many neurosurgeons with no jobs to go into? Or why is there medical unemployment? The answer to all of this is failure of workforce planning to incorrectly predict, model, and train the number of a role that you need. And you could apply this to anything, to doctors, to nurses, to paramedics, to mental health practitioners, to whatever you want. Obviously, if you have a centrally funded and crucially centrally planned health system, which we do in the UK, but not all countries do, you need to be able to model how many of a thing you're going to need in 10 years time or whatever. Workforce planning is really hard, really complicated, very difficult to do well. So that's kind of the background to all of this. Why has doctor substitution happened particularly? The answer is shortage, particularly in more economically deprived or rural areas. Emergency medicine, I think, is the simplest area that you can look at this, because emergency medicine is an example of a service that has to have 24/7 uptime, right? It's not quite the same as other specialties that are a bit more elective. Like if you don't have enough neurosurgeons, really at one time you need the number of neurosurgeons to do the life-saving neurosurgical operations. Like that is your minimum floor that you need. In terms of then doing anything electively, you might want to train more neurosurgeons because otherwise your waiting lists are going to go up and up and up for elective surgery. But fundamentally, you need the number to do your life-saving interventions. Emergency medicine is not like that, where it's obviously a service that runs 24/7, which means that you need fantastically more people to provide the service. And clearly, what has happened, for better or worse, is that there was a shortage of doctors, which I will come back to in a second. That has then led people to sort of panic and go, well, what on earth do we do? We can't close A&E, even though actually I would argue that you can, but that's another question. We can't close A&E. We need to do something. Therefore, what can we do that looks vaguely, right, ideally with some sort of training or credentialing to make sure that people still have somewhere to go and receive medical, or at that point pseudo medical care. That is why all of this has happened, is that there's a shortage of a thing, therefore we need a solution for shortage of a thing. And so you start to get substitute workforces developing. The real problem with that, I think, is twofold. One is that those shortages are often artificial, because, as we say, at the moment, there is now rampant medical unemployment in very significant numbers, and therefore you would argue, well, why do I need to train an alternative workforce or a substitute workforce if on the other hand, I've got medical employment? Like we've got both not enough doctors, but too many doctors at the same time, if that's true. And those shortages are kept artificial. Training numbers are constricted. There's only a certain number of people being let through towards senior practice. And so as one might say, it insists upon itself. If a government can restrict training supply, which then produces an artificial shortage and says, oh, well, no, there's a shortage. Oh, no, we need to keep developing our substitute workforce when they themselves are controlling the supply line. Yeah, it's that is what's happened, unfortunately. And then secondly, what I worry about is the degree to which this is being done essentially by stealth. This process is, are patients ultimately aware of what is happening in this situation? Because if a government minister stands up on TV and says, well, there's a shortage of doctors, of course you need to be prepared to see someone else if you go to A&E or your GP surgery or whatever, on the face of it, that sounds reasonable. But no one puts their hand up and goes, well, no, the only reason that there's a shortage is that you made there be a shortage in the first place because you, as the sitting government, controlled entry to medical school, entry to the foundation program, entry to specialty training. All of these things are firmly within your control. So that all of this stuff is a combination of incompetence, or at the very least, an inability to do a complex task properly. Whether we call that incompetence or inability is up to you, and some degree of maleficence, in my view. There is willful move away from keeping tasks and roles as purely doctor-led or for doctors. Because ultimately, if you can break down a doctor's role into lots of little constituent tasks and then delegate them all out, then what that does is it depowers the medical profession, who are very heavily unionized compared to other professions, very expensive as a workforce, and difficult to manage, more so than many other workforces. And there is nothing that certain government figureheads and people would like than to completely break the professional bargaining power of doctors as a profession. That is very well known. That was Jeremy Hunt's entire playbook. And that's what happened in the 2016 strikes. That was all about breaking the doctors and showing that it was possible to do so. And he did to some degree. He was quite successful. So that was a long answer, and I apologize, but it's lots of spinning wheels. Some of it is because workforce planning is really hard and it's very hard to do well. A lot of it is weaponized and willful, and it's quite difficult to tease apart who is doing what.
Amazing answer, and I think it was quite a big question, and I think it's I think what we've realized now is that a lot of things are interplay, and a lot of things are kind of stemming from the same issue, which in this case we can maybe say is quite poor workforce planning. I think it's another big question, Ollie, but I was going to ask you, if West Streeting came and sat with you today and he gave you the entire, let's say, responsibility to try and fix the NHS within the next 20 to 30 years, what would you say are the most pertinent issues to be dealt with? Or rather, because I know this is quite a big question, what would you do that you would think can stabilize the way our healthcare system is at the moment? Because I think as most people would agree, it's not looking particularly bright, whether that's for patients or for doctors. What would you change?
What I would ask of any health minister or the prime minister, really, given that it's more their problem, is what we desperately need as a country is a sensible conversation about what the role of the NHS is and what it's going to do. Because from my perspective, and I could be wrong, and I'd be very happy to be challenged on this, what I perceive is we have an older and sicker population that is increasingly comorbid and so will consume more resource. Because our population is aging, that means there are fewer and fewer people who are economically active to support paying in to pay for that system. So at the same time as healthcare will become more expensive, we have fewer people working and paying in less proportionally. At the same time as treatments are becoming more advanced, more expensive, all of the incredible immunotherapies and chemotherapies and gene therapies and all of these things that didn't exist, 50 years ago, these amazing treatments that are themselves increasingly going to be very expensive. The question is what can we afford and what is the NHS going to provide and what is it not going to provide? And what are we willing to pay for as a country and as a society that has an NHS? The NHS is a wonderful thing. This free at the point of use for whoever needs it is wonderful. But resources are not unlimited, right? And how are we going to square the circle on that? Is every treatment going to be available on the NHS? Which ones might we want to prioritize? And if we do want a free at the point of use system that pays for everything that we might need it to, including the treatments that no person would ever be able to afford by themselves, then how are we going to pay for it? And how much tax basically is each person going to pay? Because the very consistent finding is that I think the population of the UK does believe in the NHS and wants to maintain it and wants to keep it and almost expects access to that free at the point of use system, but is unwilling to pay for it, is not willing to pay the increased amount of tax that it would take to fund such a system. Now, it is also true that what the NHS desperately needs is massive investment, like on the order of tens of billions. And that's not necessarily even a lot in the context of a system the size of the NHS. A recent estimate that I heard, assuming that you would need to, if you brought yourself up to speed with like repairing every building, for example, that currently needs repairs, I think the number is somewhere between 30 and 60 billion. Like that's how far behind we are in terms of keeping up with maintenance. So that's just to get everything working at the level it should be working at, let alone investment on top. We talked about AI earlier. You cannot roll out a nationwide AI implementation until all your data is stored and coded and electronic and there's correct governance in place. Now, my trust runs on paper notes. You can't, without a complete rehaul and an electronic system, you can't even begin to do anything with AI, no matter how good you think AI is or isn't. So what I would say to someone like West Streeting or any government minister really is, let's put all of the AI and crazy genomics and these neighborhood health centers and all of the like fiddling around the edge, little sort of talking points that you want to talk about on Good Morning Britain or whatever. Let's put all that to one side and say, what is the NHS actually for? That's the first thing. Having a sensible conversation with the public. What do you want the NHS to do? And whatever you decide you want it to do, how are we going to pay for it? And how much tax are you willing to pay in order to pay for it? I think unfortunately, until we can have that conversation, which, to be honest, I don't even think we are able to do, because any politician who has that conversation will be immediately voted out during the next election cycle and replaced with a grifter who tells you that they do have the answers. We're not we're not going to get anywhere. That we're going to remain in a phase of managed decline, as the phrase is. Things are probably going to get worse.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack with that, isn't it? And it's quite startling actually when you talk about actually the solutions to it. They're quite how much of the public like actually having a discussion about those kind of things. So I think it's more than just between us doctors and nurses and kind of managers. It's kind of ultimately what are the public happy to pay for and deal with, really.
Doctors
Just
cannot
bearing
fix this
it back.
problem. That this is not a doctor
Mm,
problem, or it's not a nurse problem. It is a society existential level
yeah.
problem.
Absolutely. And just because I know we're running a little bit over time, Oliana, it's honestly the hour's gone so quick. There's so much to talk about. But I'll quickly just put us back onto talking about you again. And it's we know you are now an ST1 in Plymouth and the South West Neurosurgery Centre. How has that been?
Oh, it's awesome. You know, the team are great, and I normally have a rule about, and this is a good rule if you're active on social media, is never talk about your workplace online. That is a good rule. Unless it's positive, of course, then talk about them and they will love it. But I have zero qualms about singing the praises of the team at Plymouth at the South West Centre. The consultant body are really nice, and neurosurgery can be a toxic place sometimes. It can be a very difficult place to work in. People are often quite highly strung, and there's some big personalities. But I can very, very happily put my hands up and say that the team, the consultants, the registrars, my SHO colleagues are all lovely, and it's a great place to work. Very busy. I think Queen Square spoiled me a little bit by it not being a trauma unit and not doing the emergency work. Down here in the southwest, we are the regional neurotrauma centre, and you feel it. you 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 feel and you experience it. But in terms of a place to be as a young developing neurosurgeon, it's a great place to be.
And how have you felt about kind of now that you're in training? And I guess it's you know, within 2 years or something that you'll be the neurosurgical registrar.
Yeah.
It's quite a famous job role, isn't it? And it's
Oh.
how do you feel you're making those steps into becoming the registrar in the sense that, let's say, how do you feel you're building your knowledge, and ultimately, do you feel comfortable
Oh, it's a good
holding
question.
that blade? It's probably one of the most difficult things to do in the hospital.
Yeah, so many FY1s to bully, man. Like, bring it on. I'm being facetious. I think the difference maybe is that my mentality, I suppose, has shifted in that I was always wary of giving myself into the specialty or putting too much of myself in before I got into training, because obviously you didn't know whether or not that was going to be your reality, right? It's difficult to give 100% of yourself over to it because you might get stung. I think now that I have been through that, and now that I know that bar some sort of disaster, that I am going to be the neurosurgical reg, then it is, as you say, like it's now your responsibility to make sure that you're ready. I know that that time is coming and it will come quickly when I am going to be given that on-call bleep. And the certainty now that I have the training position has allowed me to just fully immerse myself, I think, in a way that I couldn't necessarily before. And so now what's changed is when I, much more so than I did before, or maybe I could have been doing it before, is whenever I see a patient or examine them, or increasingly I do a bit of an operation, or I'm looking at what the registrars are doing, much more now I'm asking, well, why are you doing that? Why did you do it that way? What are you thinking? Like, how did you make that decision? Because I recognize that if I don't know the answers to these things, then I can't do the same job that I see them doing. Often they make it look easy, like they know what they're doing, but I know it's not, and I know they find it very stressful. But I'm obviously not in a place yet where I can necessarily always decide how someone is going to be managed, or whether they should be started on anti-epileptic drugs or not, or whether they should be given steroids, or how they should be counseled about a particular procedure, or how you manage uncertainty, or how you speak to the consultant about something. But now that I know that I need to know that for sure, because if I don't, it's going to cause problems. You almost become a bit like a sponge again, like a very young child develops very quickly in terms of their cognition and what they can do. It feels like that again, because there's a lot to say about professional identity formation, I think, which is again one of those slightly soft hippie phrases, but it is very important that you know where you need to be, right? And you're going to start to see yourself as the person holding that bleep one day, or doing the operation, or seeing someone in clinic. And that it, it, it just makes everything a bit clearer, I think, because you know where you're going, you know what you need to do. So you go to work every day and you look around a bit more and you pay a bit more attention to what everyone is doing.
Exactly, and I think what's really nice about you not only enjoying Plymouth, but also the workforce around you. So, your consultants and your registrars and your pairs. One thing I've always found about neurosurgery quite unique to us is that ultimately, I've spent some time in orthopedics as well, for example, and you realize that actually there's so much to be learned out there by way of internet. There's apps, and you can click any part of the body and the bone, and it'll tell you how to manage that fracture.
Yeah.
With neurosurgery, you probably realize the same as Ollie, but there's not much by way of information online. It's actually a lot of things rely with the person holding that bleep, and I guess that makes it even so more important that actually you're learning from your registrars and your consultants, and you're asking those questions, because
Yeah.
in neurosurgery, the specialty, the consensus on how to manage a condition really is who's holding the bleep. It's incredible how much lies as a specialty with the guy holding the bleep, or the lady holding the
Yeah.
bleep.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's the evidence base. It comes back to evidence, it because you're limited in terms of evidence by the studies that you can do. And neurosurgery is, it has some unique challenges which make that very difficult. One is that it's very high acuity. a lot of the time. So if you've got someone that needs, I'm trying to think of an example, like if you've got something like malignant MCA syndrome or an acute extradural or somewhere where you need them on the table like now, to do an evacuation, you don't have a lot of time to recruit someone into a randomized trial or to do any of the things you would need to do to build a sensible study, and the person's probably unconscious and not in a state to consent to it anyway. So high acuity, small case numbers, that's the second thing. Imagine trying to do a study on glioblastoma or something, which thankfully is quite rare. But particularly once you get into rarer types of brain tumors, when you're talking about an incidence of 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, adequately powering a study for your meaningful clinical endpoint becomes increasingly difficult. And I think a small body of consultants is also the other. It's not a challenge as such, it's just the way the specialty is. But when you've got a small number of people doing very high intensity, risky procedures, particularly surgery, then ultimately it's their call, right, as to what they're going to do and what they think is right for their patient. And there's a lot of variability, therefore, like you were saying, it's often quite difficult to decide what the correct way is to do or not do something. And there are lots of unbelievable academics in neurosurgery, people like Prof. Marcus, there's Professor Hutchinson in Cambridge, my own academic supervisor, Miss Edelman. You've got some absolutely incredible academics that will be and are the future of working out these difficult questions. But it's very hard to do well and to recruit enough patients to these studies. That's something we really struggle with in neurosurgery, which is actually what my research at the moment is about. But you're right in that there's a lot of variability in practice, and as such, a lot of responsibility that comes to the consultant with that.
Exactly, but I guess ultimately that is what makes our specialty quite unique. I'm quite aware. I don't want to hold you up too long, really, but just one last thing. Being a neurosurgical trainee now, and being somebody who's you've obviously you've gathered so much experience already. What would you say is something you do in your downtime to help you de-stress, especially in a specialty like neurosurgery, where 1 minute you're taking a referral for a, cortical syndrome, but next minute you're at home catching up with the traitors. So what's how do you deal with that?
I think honestly, man, I'm quite open about the fact that I don't really have downtime as such, and that's not that's not something I'm proud of. That's not something that I think is a good thing. It's just not something that I have a lot of with the way that I live my life. And I think people having a healthy work-life balance is very important. And I understand and accept that. I'm just not very good at it. And lots of the people that I know and I work with are much the same. It's I don't know whether it's good or bad, but a lot of the people that I work with in neurosurgery are much the same, where you go to work and you think about neurosurgery all day, and then you go home and then you think about neurosurgery some more, and then you go back to work the next day and you do it all again. And that kind of is how I live my life at the moment. And I don't know whether that is good or bad. It's just how it is. Because, if I'll go to work and we'll see all the patients that I need to see and maybe go to theatre. And if, for example, I know that I'm going to theatre the next day, then I need to spend that evening reading and learning about the operation that I'm going to tomorrow, and so on. And then the next day I might be going to clinic. So I come home and I read about the condition that I'm going to the clinic of tomorrow. And I it's probably not the healthiest way to live life, but that's just how I'm finding it is at the moment. And I feel fulfilled. I don't feel sad or angry. I do it because it's what I think is the right thing to do. And I'm sure that the other people that also do it for the same reason. What time I do have off, I spend with my wife where I can, because we are training in two different deaneries. So she's an ACF in a surgical specialty just like I am. She's working in London. So we need to make time for each other. And really, like that's probably it in terms of time that I actually have. So it's very very easy to become completely absorbed into your work. And at the moment, I think that does apply to me. Obviously, I try and keep up um with other things, but they still tend to be about medicine. Obviously, the YouTube stuff that I do is usually about medicine. The last few weeks, in the time off that I've had, have been doing mock interviews really for the specialized foundation program for final year medical students, and now for ACFs, people who are interviewing for academic clinical fellowships. And that's kind of it. I don't have much spare time beyond that, but again, I do it because I think it's the right thing to do, and that's what people did for me in neurosurgery. I would absolutely not be anywhere near where I am now if other people going through exactly the same thing that I'm going through hadn't given up their precious free time to me to help me achieve what I wanted to achieve. So paying it forward is also extremely important.
Yeah, I guess it's true what they say. If you love what you do, you never work a day in your life, do you? And
Oh,
I think with
I work,
neurosurgeons.
man. I believe me, I work. But,
No, absolutely. Ollie, I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, the time's gone by so quick. There's so much to talk about. But it's been a pleasure having you back with Brain Book. You know, you've always got a family in with Brain Book, and I think there might need to be a part two. You know, especially when when you move on to ST2 and you're able to tell us all the things that you had to endure. But no, honestly, it's been amazing. We've learned so much about your journey into neurosurgery, from the corridors all the way to now being in Plymouth, and we also talked a little bit about the the NHS and how to fix it. So it's been a all-encompassing talk, but it's been amazing, and it's been great to host you. And I honestly hope to come into contact with you again, maybe at a conference or something. But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah. We have any questions from the audience? That was amazing, and thanks for tuning in as well. We'll just have a quick search. I'll look if there's any questions. If not, yeah,
Yeah.
just a bunch of thanks from the team. Thank you so much, Ollie. Been an absolute pleasure, and we hope to welcome you back soon.
You're welcome. I see one question, I think, in the
Okay, so we've got. We'll do one last one last question. This is from Anusha, who says, "I'm a current first year medical student at the University of Lancashire. What is the
Mhm.
best way to get involved in neurosurgical clinical research at this stage?"
You're a first year, chill out is my genuine honest thing. Settle in. Look, but that's practically not helpful. The easiest way, or the best way, is probably through groups like BrainBook, to be honest, and speaking to these guys and reaching out. There is a local neurosurgical unit in Preston. I forget the name of the hospital, but I was just up there in August. That's where they run the ST1 boot camp. So to try and make contact with them, because usually the answer that I give people is go to your local unit first and make contacts there. Just express interest because that's going to be the easiest thing to do. Failing local stuff, you've then got the national groups, so Brain Book, NANSIG, Neuroanatomy Collaborative, these types of groups who might be able to connect you to someone who's got things going on. But I do mean what I said in terms of the most important thing of medical school is getting your basic sciences, your anatomy, your physiology, your pharmacology down. That is the job at medical school. Don't don't feel stressed or pressured into the need to do all of this research and start padding your CV out from day one of medical school. It's just not, it's not real. I think we angst ourselves and we hype ourselves into feeling like we always need to be doing more, but settle in. You know, we're only in November, which means you must have just started medical school, you know, in the last few months. So just take some time. Oh, started in Jan. Okay, fine. Still, my point stands. Like, just try and keep calm and enjoy medical school. But the enthusiasm is great.
I think there's one more question. It's from Nishant, who how can I, as a fourth year medical student, get involved with the organization? I'd love to become a university ambassador for BrainBook.
It's on you, man.
I think no, honestly, I think yeah, no, I think a lot of us kind of people in neurosurgery or people going into neurosurgery, ultimately, you know, you do need to become affiliated with the eminent organizations. I think Ollie mentioned pretty much the main two, which is BrainBook and the and Nancy, who I have to be honest, you just need to follow their social media is the easiest thing to do, because ultimately they will always have some kind of posting every couple of months. And, you know, we always need keen medical students who are passionate like yourself to come on board and help us with things. And I think, you know, the organizations are only getting bigger. And I think the answer to that would be just follow us on socials, and you'll see all the adverts. And I can guarantee you there's lots going on all the time. So just keep an eye out on those, and you've got loads of time. Your fourth year, you've still got a year or so before you get onto finals, so you've got more than enough time to keep an eye out on social. So that's the advice I'd give you, Nishant. With that, I hope that's all the questions. If there is anything else, please do. Oh, Ollie,
there's
take it
just
away.
one that I can see about.
Yeah.
It's under Nishant's one about intercalating.
Is that let's have a look. Fine. Is it from Snehil? As an ST1 trainee, which mentor did you choose for textual literature or theatre sessions?
Assuming I understand the question properly, you need both. Is you need just like being in medical school, right? You need both, really, a foundational textbook, which might be Kumar and Clark or Harrison's or whatever it is that you want to learn, or that students are using now. And you need to go and see patients. As surgical training is exactly the same. You need to be reading all the time. So neurosurgery, the book that virtually everyone uses is Greenberg, Greenberg's Handbook of Neurosurgery. It's just recently had its 10th edition come out, I think. And theatre sessions. There is no way that you could achieve the things you need to achieve without doing both. You need to, by far, and this is, I think, is true when you're on your medical school surgical blocks as well, in any surgical specialty, by far the best thing that you can do is read about the operation the night before or in the morning before you go to theatre. looking at the anatomy, and increasingly you can watch snippets of the surgery so that you know what you're looking at. It means you can take away so much more, rather than if you don't do that, you just inevitably, particularly in the abdomen, you end up just looking at like goop, essentially, don't you? Or like, you know, lumps of something. It's very difficult to tell what is what. But if you know your anatomical landmarks and you can follow it step by step, the plane that the surgeon is following, it's all methodological. They're doing what they're doing in a way for a reason, and you need to know what that way is. So read, and then go to theatre.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. That's ultimately what we still have to do even at this stage. But we'll wrap it up there
Yep.
in case there's no more questions. But like I said, Ollie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you back at Brain Book M Day. We hope to host you again soon, and yeah, hopefully see you around.
Thank you very much for having me, guys. It's a pleasure.